Another story is the story of my grandfather who left Ireland. And he left during the Troubles. And our Irish cousins tell us now that they think he was scared of being conscripted into the Irish army, or sorry, the English army, who were kind of trying to take care of the Troubles in Ireland. There was a lot of violence in Southern Ireland. And he came over, and he ended up working in Dauphin, Manitoba. And then eventually he worked as a farmhand and a hired man. And then in 1938, he finally had enough money to buy his first farm. And so the stories in my family come from a lot of variety of experiences. The story, this particular image, is a story from the year after they bought that farm. In 1939, oh, I'm just going to go back. Sorry, it won't go back for me. Okay, in 1939, the Royal Tour went through on the train, and my grandmother and grandfather couldn't afford to license their Model T, so they hid it behind the grain elevator and went to see the King and Queen. So from these stories of my family and the experiences I have from my parents' small town life and childhood, I've done a lot of artwork over the years. I did two major bodies of work. I did a body of work called Small Town Stories, that were stories from the area around Zelma, where they farmed, and from the town of Zelma. And then I also did a major exhibition on the alphabetical rail line that talked about the history of Zelma being the alphabetical end of the line, which for me was a really interesting metaphor for my family, because I'm first generation urban. And my parents were the last people in my immediate family to grow up on the farm. And so the idea of Zelma being the Z of the alphabetical rail line, and then hearing all these stories of small town life was very poignant to me. Now, some of the other artwork that really impacted me when I was a child was something like Robert Hurley. And actually, my aunt and uncle who lived on my dad's family farm, the house on the left is where my dad grew up, and then my uncle and aunt who took over the farm ended up building a newer home. They had Hurleys hanging in their dining room. And so I actually got to see that important Saskatchewan painter's work in person at an early age. My dad loved farming, but he was the youngest, or second youngest, of 8 children. So the chances of him having a life as a farmer, it just wasn't a possibility. But he was involved in agriculture, and I think at heart he was a farmer for his whole life. And in later years, luckily my sister married a man who went back and took over his family farm. And I think my dad got to live out some of his dreams of farming. This particular image is very special to me because I did a major project for the Saskatchewan legislature. And it was about 100 Saskatchewan symbols. And I asked people to send me images that they thought represented Saskatchewan. And the secret that I'm only telling you here today is that I put that image of my dad with the tractor in behind the painting, right behind the window of the Premier's office. And my dad was a lifelong civil servant. He worked as an agrologist, and he went and talked with dairy farmers. And I just knew he would have been tickled to think that he was the one sitting in the Premier's office. And that painting, so it's a nice legacy for me. As part of that work, he was a road warrior. He drove all around Saskatchewan and had a great love for the grid road map and maps in general. And he passed that love on to us. I still have several grid road maps. We have them tucked into our car, and even though we usually use Google Maps, there's something about seeing the whole province and that extensive road system that for me will always bring me childhood memories of traveling with my family. Because aside from his work, both my dad and mom loved to travel. And what they really liked was to pile us into the family car and take us on holidays. So here's my dad. He's working all the time, and he is doing all this driving, and then it's summer holidays, and what do? We get in the vehicle and we go driving. And this particular image was from a trip we did when I was 8. And I have 4 siblings, and from age 8 to 18, we all piled into the station wagon and we headed to Ontario, dragging a trailer and stopping at every relative we knew along the way. So I bring this up because all of these stories and experiences have heavily influenced the narrative path that I've taken as a painter. In fact, those maps, after my dad passed away, my mom asked me if I would like his collection of maps, and I did a whole series called Passages that was kind of a tribute to my dad and the road less traveled, and I actually collaged the map images underneath the paintings and then painted different roadways that I knew that he had journeyed on. So you can kind of see just underneath the surface of the paintings that grid road map of my childhood. And look carefully at these paintings because they really inspired, I think, the body of work I'm doing now, which is partly the dash cam series and then other views of the land. But there's something very radically different, which you're going to notice in a minute. As I was doing all of these different bodies of work, I started a major project that took me on residencies to different parts of Canada to explore speaking to people and hearing their experiences of place. And I started to paint places in response to this. And that was the first time that I did the dash cam recordings with my camera mounted in my car. And I started thinking a lot about how in the history of landscape painting, often it's these very pastoral scenes or scenes seen from a distance. But really for us living in Saskatchewan, almost all the time we are looking at the landscape through the windshield. So that really started to creep into my work, and I started doing a side project on these dash cam views at the same time that I was doing this major project where I was interviewing people. And what that project did was it forced me out of my comfort zone. I had done these very kind of narrative paintings. They always had people in them. They had things happening. And in response to interviewing people, I asked them what place they wanted me to paint. And I went and I painted it. And so here I was being confronted with some really pure landscape scenes and kind of trying to decide how I was going to tackle that as a painter. And I thought back to that art history, and I felt like it also mattered how I painted them. I kind of wanted that weight of classical painting or historic painting so that I was really taking their stories that they told me in a kind of more serious, sort of more traditional painterly way. Some of the stories I collected got me returning to those stories from my childhood. People telling me about what it was like to live on a farm while a city grew around them. This is on the outskirts of Edmonton, and this was the last remaining working farm in the area. I also learned things that, although I had this collection of anecdotal kind of nostalgic ideas about farming, I went and actually talked to people who were making their livelihood farming today. And I got taken out to visit cattle in the field and learned that you can give them garlic and it keeps the bugs away. And I also had a really interesting couple of days in a residency in Inglis, Manitoba, where I actually rode around on combines. And so a volunteer in the area took me from, they had it all arranged, great thing with cell phones, and I would go to the field at the right moment and get into the combine with the farmer and go for a ride. And what really struck me with this particular series of interviews was how fast things were transitioning. So that childhood experience of my parents was still happening on some farms in that area. But more importantly, there's this huge move to these really large-scale farms and computerized production. And I rode in a combine where literally I sat in an air-conditioned combine with somebody while a computer was driving the combine. And I said to the farmer, "Do you have to be here?" And he said, "Oh, just to adjust the height." So we were right, and he said, "It's amazing," he said. We plant our seeds in the spring, and it's all tracked by GPS, and then we follow that same trail to put in our inputs. And then at harvest time, we follow that trail and we harvest. And he said, we're so excited and proud of this technology. It's making us the most efficient farmers in the world. So it's a very interesting experience to talk to people who are living multiple kinds of experiences of the land. And that particular 2-day period really has stuck with me as I moved into doing the work I'm doing now, which is kind of this witnessing of the landscape. The other story from that entire project that has really, really sat with me came from a lady living in Moose Jaw area. And she was a traditional healer, and she collected plants as part of her traditions and practices. And her story was the story of how difficult it was becoming to find natural areas where she could go and harvest her plants, and also the feeling of not quite knowing if she was going to be confronted by somebody who didn't think she should be on that land, and how it was really impacting the most important aspect of her life. And so I kind of carry those two stories with me in that strange position we're in right now, where simultaneously all these different things are happening on the land. And so that I talked a lot just now about kind of the narrative of all these different paintings and what I was doing. But I also am a technician and a painter. And before we look at the body of work that I'm doing right now, I want to talk a little bit about media and method. I'm an acrylic painter. This is my painting palette. It's great. It's really big, and it's got paper you put on top of a sponge so it can keep my paints wet. And I can mix all these different colors and have them there to work with. And then the margarine lids are for when it gets a little loosey-goosey, and I mix some medium with it, and I don't want it to slop around my palette. Very effective, the margarine container. And it takes me back to that Art History 110. And the fact that I love that I can carry with me the practice of other artists throughout history. And as an academically trained artist, somebody who went to university, I'm proud of being a part of that tradition, and I'm very lucky to feel informed by it. And there were strange coincidences with that article that I stumbled across. One was these Veduta paintings, because part of the method in my practice has been an obsession with viewpoint. And in fact, I came across Veduta paintings kind of in the mid-2000s, and I was really entranced by this idea of, because I'm interested in human geography, of them documenting places, and these Italian artists trying to find the highest point in town so they could get up there, and they even would sometimes set up camera obscura, like pinhole cameras, and use technology to document those places and paint them as a record of their places. So while I was doing all this other kind of work, I also started trying to find permission to get up on top of buildings. And these paintings started a little earlier than some of the last ones I showed you. In 2008, I started accessing buildings in Regina and trying to get these Veduta viewpoints and document the neighborhoods that I lived in. Just like the Italians had documented the great monuments of Italy, I thought I should document the stores on 13th Avenue and Albert Street and other places. And people were great. Like, all you have to do is get in good with the building managers. And the janitors. And then you too can get on top of buildings. And so while I was doing this work, I was also thinking about that narrative project I was doing where I was collecting stories. And the two came together in this huge project called Populating Veduta, which was the start of the quiet stories and narrative paintings. And I rented a scissor lift, and I got permission from the city to close down the street for a Sunday morning, and I interviewed people in the neighborhood about their lives, and then I had them populate the street for me. And I did this really large body of work. So you can see how all these images that I collected ended up being these very large-scale paintings with the Veduta viewpoint. And there is something really compelling to me about that overview. And it led me to want more. I wanted more. And so as we were pursuing this collection of stories, we thought it would be a great idea to try using drones. Now, this was early on in the days of drones, and they weren't quite as sophisticated as they are now, and it was not very successful. To be perfectly blunt, I think we crashed the drone for every successful painting that I actually made from a drone shot. And my poor husband would be rebuilding the drone, and it didn't have fancy GPS or any of the things that they had now. But we did manage to get a few of these kind of lovely overview pieces that I included in that big narrative project, which was called Quiet Stories from Canadian Places. Now, lucky for me, I was not the only one with a passion for heights. My husband had, for many, many years, really wanted to pursue flying. And he kind of put it off, and then as he was getting closer to retiring, he said, you know, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go get my private pilot's license. And so he worked really hard, and he achieved that. And the first time I went up with him, it was life-altering. The view from the plane was that view that I had been looking for, and I just didn't know it. And, you know, we all fly in and out of places on commercial airlines, and we all look down and think, oh, isn't that lovely? Isn't that amazing? But being able to get up in a small private plane and look at the landscape, suddenly I had the view that told all my stories. I had the view of the agricultural land. I had the really large fields that were being computer harvested and planted with that really precise pattern. And I had the small arteries, river valleys, and where the glaciers had gone through, where there was still that natural landscape where people can go and harvest natural plants. And it just was really impactful for me, and I knew I had to do work with it. And as I started to work on the work, I had to laugh because I remembered back to that farming history and the whole tradition also of aerial views of farms. And as I was kind of getting this slide presentation together, I stumbled across this image. And what's really surprising to me is this is actually one of our family farms in Ireland that my grandfather Peever's family had. And so that tradition of these aerial views of the farming is also another kind of interesting tradition that I kind of feel I'm touching a little bit with the work that I'm doing. And I also stumbled across this image. And one of the many jobs I had throughout my life was as a tree planter. And one summer we did helicopter contracts, and I kind of forgot that I tried to take these pictures of the aerial view of the camp and the forest. So I kind of feel like obviously there's been this deep underlying need in me to have this overarching viewpoint. And what about those other artists? Those artists that we can't deny have had a powerful place in the history of painting. I think you see remnants of their work in what I'm doing. And in my life as an artist, I have really, really tried whenever I can manage it to get out and really look at painting in galleries and major historic collections when I can go and see. And to see that paint in person changes utterly your idea of what it is to paint. These meaty, beautiful, colorful paintings like the Fauvus, like André Durand, who actually Maurice Vlaminck was my hero from that group. And you can see that in my work. I'm working thick, I'm working colorful. And even like painting that doesn't really look like mine, but these famous atmospheric paintings teach us the rules of how to create space in artwork. And I don't know if I should reveal my secrets here, but you know, that idea of having really kind of whited out and like less intense color in the background and then more intense up top so that you get that real feeling of this huge landscape space and then details in the foreground. Okay, yes, I did steal from the mall. I admit it. And then, you know, you get this move into more modern painting where they tried to deny space And they just went at it with all kinds of equal intensity of color. And these paintings feel flatter. They don't feel like they've got that big atmospheric space, but they've got this vivid color and these bold strokes that give you a feeling and connection to the landscape. And that sense of patterning and color and form is often what I see when I'm up in the air looking at these landscapes and documenting these places. This article killed me because it had these really like catchy kind of labels, like tormented landscape. When I looked at Van Gogh for the first time, what I saw was the joy of just applying thick, bold strokes of paint to the canvas, and the fact that painting isn't just flat. Painting is sculptural. Painting lives three-dimensionally in our world when we get to see it in person. Like this art fair, what a beautiful opportunity to leave the screen behind. Sorry, you're here in front of the screen. And see artwork in person and understand how the surface of a painting becomes its own story and becomes something that changes how you feel about what you're looking at. And, you know, I can't say that those 10 artists were the only people who influenced me, because there's a vast history of painting and there's a really beautiful, strong history of painting tradition right here in Western Canada. And I was very lucky as a student to come out of my BFA, and I actually went to work at Art Placement. Bonnie Bentham's sitting right there. And I got to look really closely at artwork by people like Dorothy Knowles, and her ability to take the complexity of what we see in the landscape and just with a simple brush stroke render and give us a sense of the brush line and the weeds that run along the edge of the field. And people like Gregory Hardy, who his handling of clouds, okay, there's no doubt, it's an influence. Like, come on, you can see it. And that boldness and that intensity that captures how we feel as prairie people looking at our landscape. And so I think this body of work above below, where I've got collections of work from these aerial views, and then I've got that passage through the landscape that you take as you go down the roadways, for me is my witness to my experience of the stories I've heard about the land, all the complex feelings I carry with me from those stories, and the great, wonderful history of painting landscape. So what will your favorite landscape be? Well, I don't know quite yet, because I'm still heading down that road. And I do know that some of the other experiences I had with Quiet Stories are starting to creep in and influence where I'm heading next. And that's my love of the water. So I actually am just starting to document aerial viewpoints that include riverways and canals and lakes, and sort of looking at, again, how water plays a role in our lives on the prairies as well. So that's my slightly meandering talk on how I became a landscape painter, but I don't really think I am. I think I'm actually a narrative painter. I think that's the basis of who I am and what I do. And I hope when people look at my views that has that sense of a deeper story or a deeper underlying content that informs me and makes me paint so many layers and so vigorously trying to kind of capture my feelings about the land. So look at that, bang on, 30 minutes. Thank you so much for coming. I don't know if anyone has any questions, but I know we're running out of time, but I am gonna go to the Slate Fine Art booth after the talk, and I'd be really happy to talk to anybody one-on-one about my work. Any quick questions before I wrap up? I told you all. Thank you very much for coming.